Good afternoon, everyone. Elected members and for those members of the public that are listening, welcome. The purpose of today is to talk through the proposals that are being put forward as part of the annual plan for 22-23 and then seek some direction in terms of where we're heading in terms of the final document that will be coming forward to you for approval on the 22nd of June. To give you a bit of a recap, we held a briefing on May 18th last week where we talked through the key components of this presentation, and there will be some strong similarities between the information that was presented last week and what you'll see today. The purpose of the workshop today is for members of the public and yourselves to work through that information again in detail and have the opportunity to ask questions, and where we can get as much understanding about where this council is comfortable heading as we move forward to the decisions that we need to make on the 22nd of June. As we then move into a brief, we'll have one further briefing on the 8th of June, and that's more for this table just to check in and make sure that the direction that we're going forward with in terms of finalizing the document that's coming forward for adoption on the 22nd of June is as accurate as it can be in terms of what we think the table is going to put forward in terms of decisions. And that's really from a process perspective to make sure that when we're drafting the content of the document, that it reflects the decisions that this council wishes to make in terms of finalising the annual plan. Then in terms of the final portion of setting the annual plan will be on the 29th of June when we will have our rate setting. And just to summarize again, the key reason why that's different from the 22nd of June is because we have a number of properties that we have a level of, or an assumption of how much growth we're going to have into the district. As we have more growth into the district, there's more properties to share that rates increase over. And so we try and hold off as long as we can in terms of understanding what that growth looks like before we set the rates per dollar of value. So as a brief recap, in the long-term plan, we set a rates increase for year 2 of 7.4, and currently the proposal that's with you on the table for discussion is a rates increase of 7%. So that's a small reduction from what was planned in terms of the long-term plan.
Thanks. Will you be breaking down later how that 7% is made up?
So we will be breaking it down at an activity level in terms of where the different increases are coming from. In terms of examples, if you meant examples at a ratepayer level, that will be coming to the 8th of June briefing, because what we wanted to do first was make sure we've got the right direction in terms of what this council would like to see reflected in the annual plan, and then we'll be able to finalise that and bring it forward in terms of examples, property examples for the 8th of June.
No, I meant percentages. So of that 7%, how much is depreciation, how much is solid waste, how much is what? So we understand.
It's there in dollar terms. I can absolutely translate that into as needed into percentage terms of the rates increase. Yeah. As well, just recapping here that prior to Christmas there was a decision made not to consult on this annual plan, and that was based on the understanding that there was not significant change between what was agreed in the long-term plan for the first year and what was being put forward for year 2. What we will note, and there is definitely some conversation around the level of capital spending for this annual plan, and that will be absolutely a reduction from what was proposed in the LTP over a 2-year period if we look at this year and next year. But the proposal at this stage in terms of the conversation is that very likely we will be needing to do a fairly strong reset in terms of year 3 of the long-term plan, and the annual plan for next year is very likely to be an amended long-term plan rather than just a standard annual plan. And that's to make sure that any reductions that we're proposing in terms of year 1 and year 2 capital program that there is a clear understanding of what the council plans to spend, particularly for years 3 to 10, and that's particularly important given what's happening with the Three Waters reform. So firstly, overall, I'll work through the increases and changes that are proposed at an individual line in terms of the different types of revenue and expenditure that we have. Please feel free to jump in if you have questions. What we will be doing as we work through each activity area, so I'll be doing this at a high level, then we'll work through each activity area. When we get to each activity area, it would be great if you could signal to us if there's anything within those proposals that you are not comfortable with and that you may be likely to vote against, or to put other options forward as part of your. I know it's not a decision-making meeting, but it would be really helpful if we could get some signal from you, either where you may have some discomfort or you may wish to put something else forward in terms of the decision. So firstly, rates. At an overall level, we planned in the long-term plan to have 47,351,000 in terms of rates for next year. That has proposed to reduce by 130,000 based on what's being proposed today. In terms of subsidies and grants, we have an increase that's being proposed in this area, and that's mainly to reflect the increase in maintenance funding that we're planning to receive from Waka Kotahi. Remembering as well that this view is strictly from an operational perspective, and you won't see the capital grants and subsidies here. As well, there's some funding from Fox and Freeholding account, and that's for parks related work. So we see some more in the revenue space, but you'll also see some more in the expenditure space. From a fees and charges perspective, there's quite a bit of a few key things that are making this move. So you have the higher building activity because of the volumes that we're seeing increasing in the regulatory and the building control space. We are proposing that we increase our revenue by $1 million in this space. In terms of rental income, there's been a few changes and assumptions in terms of our properties that we lease out, and so it is reasonable to expect an extra 100,000 in next year in terms of revenue, and that's something that we have, while not budgeted for this year, we are seeing come in this year as well. The other significant item that offsets these increases are the landfill income. Because our waste is now going, and other waste, Kapiti's waste, for example, is now going to Bonnie Glen, we no longer have the landfill revenue in our books. And so that change there reflects that change in assumption. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions or comments in relation to that one?
Just given, are we on live stream here? Okay, so given we're live, due to the higher building activity, expected $1 million in your commentary just now, you've also spoken about the additional outgoings in the landfill activity. What is expected? Is that $1 million of building income? Is that clear, or is it going to have some costs come off that?
Thank you. That will absolutely have some costs come off of it. And when we move through the slides at an activity level, you'll see some of those costs within there. So in terms of employee costs, you see there that we're proposing an additional $589,000 in that space. That's to reflect a number of things, and those include market increases from what was assumed in the LTP. But in terms of what was proposed to this council prior to Christmas, there have been no other increases put forward in terms of employee costs by this council. In looking at the workload that the council has and the different costs that are being faced, particularly in relation to market pressures around resources, that could be upwards of a further $800,000, but at this stage we're not seeking any further funding from what was requested in December.
Again, just for the record, this relates to increases in staff levels to support increases. So we all know that we've got a rather large amount of staff gaps at the moment. Are we talking about increases in staff levels over and above those current vacant positions, or is this from now going forward?
So, Councillor Bishop, this isn't from now. This is from the numbers that were presented to you in December. So if we took into account the numbers now, if we were to have a full complement of staff, it would be an additional 800k on top of that. We are not requesting the additional 800k, but the other thing that I would add in is that 589 does make some assumptions around the level of vacancies we would hold. So it does not assume a full complement of staff. It assumes some vacancies.
So are we aware now, or do we have the numbers now of what the staffing level we're carrying today as opposed to December? Has that number come down or gone up?
I think it has come down. Sorry, just clarify your question. Are you asking whether we're carrying more vacancies or less vacancies?
No, it's about the number of staff we've got now. You've referred me back to December about the level of staff we've got then. So what is the number then and what is the number now?
Well, the number has increased by an additional 800k. So the numbers have increased, Councillor Bishop.
I was hoping that was converted into heads, not dollars. Because
I
when
don't
we
have
talk
that.
about
I don't have
vacancies,
that number off the
sure,
top of my
anything
head.
counts.
But what I can tell you is that additional roles have been approved and recruited for in this organisation since December. That was outside of the 589 variants presented to you in December.
And I'm just trying to get some comfort, as I'm sure the table is that when we're talking about staff vacancies, we talk about staff vacancies in numbers of people. And it'd be nice to actually get that correlation.
In relation to maintenance, there's an increase of 57,000 proposed in that space. The majority of that is in the areas where we are receiving income on the other side, so there's an offset in that space. In terms of professional services, in regards to Councillor Bishop's question, some of those you'll see in terms of professional services costs coming in terms of building consents, as well planning consultants that we need to help service higher workload in the regulatory and planning space. As well, we have some extra funding requested in the district plan space to get more work done earlier than it originally been planned, but that was originally that was borrowings funded, and it had originally been planned to be done in outer years in the long-term plan. So that's bringing that work forward, and that's no different than what we had this council agreed to do for this current year. In the business performance space, there's some funding requested to continue the procurement risk program. As well, in the infrastructure development space, there's additional funding requested in professional services space, and that's meant to cope with the additional costs that we're seeing in terms of the cost of hiring and having professional service expertise to assist this council with the program. In terms of libraries and community centres, there's some more requested there for security and monitoring, and some more in terms of in the recruitment space. Did anyone have any more questions before? You'll see these cost and revenue increases and decreases as we work through the activity area, but before we move on, did anyone have any questions? Okay. Councillor Jennings. You're on mute.
Councillor, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
That's better, thank you.
Operator error, my apologies. Look, Jacinta, you'll be aware I sent an email prior to the workshop just sort of touching over some of the themes that I was keen to cover off. And one of the themes on my list was, is there anything, particularly in that professional services space, that is not currently within the budget? And the things that come to mind are obviously a landfill-related decision-making process, and potentially some Three Waters-related spending. So those are two sort of things that come to my mind. But is there anything further that is not currently captured in those first couple of slides that we need to be mindful of as we go through and consider the different activity areas?
So I think we should be able to work through most of those areas, like for example, the landfill one. We'll talk about the additional expenditure and the assumptions around how much is proposed to increase rates or not by next year, and what proportion is going to be funded by borrowing. So that's a key assumption for the landfill that we'll talk through when we get to that activity. In terms of capital, we'll talk about the fact in terms of Three Waters. And at this stage, we spoke about it last week briefly, but the assumptions in terms of the Better Off funding, at this stage in this annual plan, we don't have that level of funding incorporated or the level of spending incorporated in this plan. But from a planning perspective, we understand that it's not actually required that we include that in this annual plan for us to be eligible for that funding. Foxton Pool's probably the last one as well that we'll talk through when we get to the capital side of things, in terms of the assumptions around that from a capital budgeting perspective.
Councillor Jennings, I think to answer your question specifically about professional services, that the only thing that does really come to mind for me is that there is nothing within the budgets around professional services associated with the landfill decision, similar to kind of the position we find ourselves in now, where we are trying to resolve an operational deficit for what was an unbudgeted item. My sense, if I was giving advice to the table, is I don't think that we're in a position to give any advice around what would need to be allocated in a budget. And I think that following future conversations with council, I think that that's about us as an organisation really looking at existing costs to see where we could achieve that from.
Thanks, Monique.
Okay, so moving on to interest. So at this stage, as you'll see signalled in the fire report, we do have a forecast saving in interest, and that for this current year, and that relates to the fact that we've had lower capital spending than we'd planned, and so the proposal is that because we've collected rates for that be used to help offset the impacts of rates for this coming year, as well. Because effectively the beginning borrowings position for this next financial year will be lower due to the fact that we've had lower capital spending in this current financial year, that we will also have lower interest next year as a result as well. So $668,000 is a reduction in what we anticipate needing from interest for rates for next year. In terms of depreciation, while the Three Waters valuation was included within the LTP, we were required to do a roading valuation last year, and that did result in some increase in terms of the level of depreciation that we had in that space. So that's a net increase in depreciation across the board of $292,000. In terms of, we've got some other costs. The majority of that relates to the fact that in terms of the election, we'll no longer have the DHB sharing some of those costs with us. And then the final point is around in the December meeting where we discussed the long-term plan and the annual plan and potential options around reducing rates. Some of the discussion was around looking at our Three Waters area and potentially reducing the level of funding that we'd applied for maintenance. across the water space, and that totaled $400,000. At this stage, the proposal is that while we understand there needs to be a commitment to reducing our cost to serve, that for this annual plan we don't directly identify that it's coming from the 3 water space at this stage. We'll need to come back to you with proposals of where or indications of where we'd like that to come from, but at this stage we haven't done that detailed work yet.
Sorry, but that amount is factored into this 7% flat. So it's like a 1% placeholder yet to be determined.
Yeah, so just to clarify that, Councillor Bishop, the 400k was in the numbers that you saw in December. The difference is it was allocated towards a line called 3 Waters Maintenance, and I'm not comfortable that we proceed with removing that from 3 Waters Maintenance when I think we've got some more due diligence to do to give ourselves all confidence that that's where the money should come out of. But obviously the commitment that that 400k needs to be found from somewhere across the organisation.
In terms of this slide here is intending to just highlight some of the key assumptions that have informed the first part of the conversation today. So in terms of growth, when we talk about the 7% rates increase, it factors in that we've got an assumption of growth being 1.7%. So if you look at the total dollar rates increase, it's closer to 8.7, but because we have a 1.7% increase in the number of in the value and number of properties, then there's more properties for those rates to be shared across. So the impact on the houses that are here will be lower and will be closer to the 7. Just to highlight that we do track that very closely, and at this stage, the number of properties, I think it's 340 or so, that we're expecting to come in the door before the end of June is tracking well to meet that target.
I'm pleased we're having that conversation now, but I think we need to settle on some language which we all in the community can begin to understand, because we can talk gross and net, we can talk pre-growth, post-growth. We need to have some language that we settle on as a community to say that because of growth, the actual rate impact on the whole community now is 7%, whereas if it wasn't for the growth we're experiencing, it would be 8.7. And in the past, when we have, as a table, have gone out to the community with a rate increase, it has been the gross amount. It has always been the gross amount. And I'm just a bit nervous that we are not being completely open and saying, hey, we're going out with a 7% increase when we know damn well it's 8.7.
So I think what we're hearing from you, Councillor Bishop, is once Council have adopted an annual plan and wherever that lands, that when we communicate to the public the outcome of that, we explain the benefits of growth to that percentage.
Just to flag, last year we did the average rates increase, which was the after growth figure, but it was the first year that we had done that. Yeah. But I hear what you're saying in terms of the consistent messaging.
Yeah, we all around here get it, but I know that doesn't transfer outside these walls too often.
Councillor Jennings, did you have a question there?
Yeah, thanks, Jacinta. Yeah, I think that's important. I totally agree with the comments from Councillor Bishop, because as we're about to talk about the landfill additional costs and even depreciation funding, we know that at the moment that some of what could have been a rate increase is actually going to be debt funded, or that's the proposal. And so we've got to, I guess, be just upfront with the community about the trade-offs and what that actually means as well, is that because essentially in that terms of that second bullet point there, we're actually artificially keeping rates lower, but increasing the debt mountain that we've got by throwing what should be 3.4% an additional 3.4% increase in rates, but we're actually borrowing to fund that. So we've got to be, I think we do have to be really upfront with the community about how we're managing growth and debt funding of what would otherwise be operational costs that they would need to meet through rates.
I think that's a good point. One thing I'd highlight in that area is because I had a quick look at the Taxpayers Union report, for example, last night. I know we've just submitted information for this year, but for last year we were the 4th lowest council in New Zealand in terms of our operating costs per household. So if you take, that doesn't include interest, but if you take, because they don't report it that way, but if you look at us across New Zealand, we're the 4th lowest in terms of our operating cost per household. So from an efficiency perspective, even though it might not seem like it sometimes, we are tracking well in that space. But when you look at our debt levels on the other side of it, they are relatively high. And also we have interest costs that are higher as a result of that, and we also have struggles in terms of the level of income that we can get from other sources other than rates. So just thought it might be interesting just in terms of some context with that conversation.
And Jacinta, over time, this council has borrowed in the past to fund depreciation rather than charging it through rates to keep rates down. And I recall a slide a week or two ago where you told us how much over time we've actually put what could have been funded through rates, the depreciation actually funded by debt. Can you recall what that figure is? Yes. Oh, there.
This is just a slide which, from a visual perspective, can give some view of the level of the slide's probably not quite, the heading's not quite right there but looking from 2007 back to where we proposed in 2036, this gives a view of the level of non-funded depreciation and how that's built up over the years. So by the time you get to 2024, 2025, that has effectively made our borrowings up to $80 million higher than it would have been if we had fully funded the level of depreciation or asset use or whatever term you would use in that space. So while our operating costs are low, we have in that sense artificially kept rates lower than they would have been otherwise if we had been fully funding that cost of asset replacement over time. So that's led to us having limited capacity in terms of what we can do in the borrowing space because of that. Through this long-term plan, there was some conversation through the financial strategy setting that this council wished to bring that forward, and Standard & Poor's, in terms of, we've got them here tomorrow visiting, that's a key item they look at as well in terms of, are you fully funding your cost of operations, including your asset use through rates, and because it is a direct impact on the borrowing space. So in the financial strategy, as part of the long-term plan, we said by year 5, we would look to be fully funding depreciation. So you can see from year 25, you start to see that coming down, and that's because we are fully funding but effectively rating a little bit more to help reduce that level of debt that's accumulated over time from that asset replacement not quite being where it needs to be in terms of depreciation. So that's a conversation, I think, Councillor Jennings, in terms of what's the right balance between rates and asset replacement funding. And I know it's often a hotly debated topic around any council table, really. Councillor Jennings, did you have a...
Yeah, Jacinta, thanks. You kind of preempted what I was going to say, which is that slide's a little bit horrifying, to be honest, that debt mountain there. And I definitely think we need to schedule, and obviously we can't, as part of this annual plan process, pull the levers and push the buttons to change too much in this space. But we definitely need to program a conversation around depreciation as part of the LTP amendment next year. Because I remember when we looked at the looked at the negative rate increase, and we were putting $1 million of depreciation funding on the debt books, there was an outcry around the table. But I look at this table and that's been the practice for years and years and years and years. So we absolutely need to have a conversation about it to find, I guess, what the appetite is and make sure that everyone has an understanding of what the trade-offs are.
Which is a nice segue into my question. The trade-off being, like, I don't like looking or talking about this sort of stuff in isolation. So if we're going to present that, can you please put up the next slide that shows me what the rate impact would have been on our community if we had fully funded depreciation? Otherwise, it's a pointless exercise because it would have been, that's why we've got that, because we're trying to balance what we spend with affordability. And this is where this whole debate comes back to, and we're responsible for that. The decision makers around this table, and we will cop that. No trouble. I don't have any issue with that because I know how drastically worse the next graph would have been.
So kind of acknowledging that, Councillor Bishop, but bringing you back to what is a key point and kind of one of the key drivers for why we are sitting at 7% is obviously the impact of the additional costs on the landfill and how we're going to treat them in the annual plan. And so recognising this isn't a decision-making process forum, but it is a place where we're wanting to get a steer from council. Is council comfortable with the current way in which we are proposing that we fund the $1.9 million additional expenditure? Which we're trying to find the balance between debt and rates, albeit understanding your point, Councillor Jennings, around how that impacts the perception of what the rates actually would have been.
I'm happy to ask the question again every year, whether we're prepared as a table, what will that look like if we make a decision to put some more of our renewals budget on the debt book rather than rate funding and see what the impact that has on our rates. We know it's, what is it, 1%, is it 400,000, is it 470,000 or 430, yeah, okay, so.
So can we come to the renewals, how we fund the renewals, but specifically to this question, which is how are we going to deal with the $1.4 million less revenue and the $500,000 additional expenditure in the landfill? We're proposing that is split across rates and borrowings. Before we bring an annual plan to council for consideration, is there an additional steer that as elected members you'd like to give us around how we treat that deficit?
Not a steer, but a question. So that 1.4 million that we lose in revenue each year, plus knowing that there are going to be additional landfill costs coming up, like the remediation for the leachate, things like that 1.4 million isn't a one-off, is it? It's going to be year on year on year. So if we fund most of that through debt, are we going to be having to do the same thing next year and the next year and the next year? So basically we're just making the whole thing worse in the future if that's the case. If we're just continually going to debt fund it.
The proposal that's included in this annual plan is if we were to fully fund that extra roughly 1.9 or 2 million this year, it would have increased our rates by 4.4. At this stage, we're proposing that rather than that all impacting in year one, that we impact the rates by 1%, so approximately 450,000 in year one, and then gradually increase that so that we get to the point in it's going to take probably, if you look at the impact of rates, 4 to 5 years to be fully funding that cost increase. And that is similar to what was done for the recycling cost increase. So you would be, for example, in year one, there'd be $450,000 that you'd be funding from rates. The rest would be funded from debt. In year two, you'd say it would be $900,000 that's funded through rates, the rest through debt, and slowly you get to the point where you're no longer funding it through debt.
So, Councillor Mitchell, yes, it's not a one-off impact. We will see the cumulative impact throughout through the financial years. Probably just one point I do want to make is that I want to remind Council that the full capital costs for what I would describe as restoration aren't captured in this annual plan or even our long-term plan as a whole. There is more work to be done to understand that.
So, for a steer from me, I think it needs to be put in, not funded, for consistency, because I have fought this table every year about putting more on the debt, and there's a blanket, no, you can't do that yet. For the inconvenient reality of a decision potentially made to close the landfill, there's going to be a completely different steer given, and I think, to be honest, throw it all in there.
Right. I'm still confused. Okay, so up until this year, we were getting about 1.4 million in income from the landfill. We're losing that this year, which you're proposing that we fund a lot of that through debt. But then next year we're going to lose that 1.4 million, and next year we're going to lose it. So it's going to be an ongoing loss of income.
Yes, but of course just reminding Council that you haven't made a decision on the future of the landfill. So we are only treating that for this year, because until Council make a decision on the future of the landfill, we'd be making assumptions or predetermining an outcome that Council might still have to make, is still yet to make about the future of the landfill. But if you made that assumption that our loss this year, yes, that would look the same in future years.
Yep. But even if we, from the figures that we were given, even if we kept it open, we're not going to make the money that we were making. So it is going to be an ongoing, or it looks at the moment as though it's going to be an ongoing cost, I guess.
The indication from the modelling that was provided by Morrison Solutions was that regardless of the option, we would be facing increased costs. Yeah.
Can I come in?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, just so my view on this is I'm similar to Councillor Bishop, but I'm torn because I was against the 7% that we included in the LTP, and so I obviously adding an extra 4.4 on top of that is not at all comfortable for me. But I guess the issue is that it's really the cynical piece is that we're artificially constraining the rates in an election year to make it look better, when ultimately this is an operational cost. And if we carry through with the approach that's being proposed to debt fund this over another 3 years beyond this year, and obviously, increasing it by 1% each year, then that's an extra, by my rough calculations, an extra $3 million on the debt book. So again, as Councillor Bishop said, it's a consistency issue. And so we need to have clarity and consistency around the table in terms of our approach. So that's where I sit.
So Councillor Jennings and Councillor Bishop, while I acknowledge the concerns around consistency, I do just want to highlight to Council that you have a self-imposed rates limit of 7.5%. And so if you were to adopt an annual plan that was beyond 7.5%, you are required to consult with the community because you trigger significance. So
we're pretty much trapped anyway on this issue then.
which kind of leads to, you know, some of the advice I've been giving council obviously over the last couple of weeks around we're at a point in time in our annual plan where I know as governors you no doubt feel very limited about the levers you can pull, because right now you are constrained by the self-imposed rates limits that you set in your financial strategy and your long-term plan.
I think that regardless of whether you'd set a rates limit at 10 and we're all of a sudden proposing to increase it by a further 3.5 than was originally in the LTP, from a significance perspective, you'd probably be triggering it anyway.
Maths, not English, please. What is the significance threshold?
So our significance policy is not specific in terms of percentages, as some councils' policies are. But there is a clause in there that from a community or individual impact, that others would see that as being significant for them.
So back in December, when I raised whether we were wanting to go and consult on this, and I raised the fact that I thought we would be, 50% short of our CapEx program, and whether that was going to trigger a significance conversation. And I understand that it's not. So I'm understanding that 50% is within the significance threshold, or is it for consistency? Are we playing it convenient again?
I guess in terms of this council's table, it's when you're making that decision, do you think that having the conversations with your ratepayers, if you said, it's 10.5 now, whether they would think that they would have liked to have the say about that? From a capital perspective, I guess, it's a little bit different in terms of, I guess, it doesn't hit the ratepayers' pockets straight away. So there is some conversation about whether that capital occurs, which year that capital occurs in, and as long as it occurs in the general vicinity of when it's planned and it's still occurring, then from a significance policy perspective, that would be where that conversation had been had around the capital side of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a longer term conversation for me, because as we know, there's a huge amount of financial pressures out in the community right now for interest rates rising, mortgages, etc. We've been hammered ever since I've been on this council about our deprivation levels in this community, imposing big rate increases on our community that can't afford it, and that's why that mountain, like Councillor Bishop talked about, looks like it does. Without that, what would it look like? So for me, that bullet point in the middle, the second bullet point, I think gets the balance about right for the time. But certainly, a longer term conversation has to be, what does that look like, including the debt ceiling, including all the mechanisms, all the moving parts of what this is all about. For me, a longer term conversation. It's not right now because it's not the right time to do it. And I think it's parts we just have to suck up in the meantime. That's my humble view.
Yeah, there's no further direction around how we deal with the deficit associated with the landfill.
So basically, if we wanted to rates fund this, we'd have to get rid of a whole lot of other stuff to be within that 7% or 7.5% threshold. And so I was going to ask you sort of what percentage of the rates increase is due to depreciation?
$262,000, so I can quickly calculate how much that is. It's about half of a percent. Oh, that's in addition to what was planned in the LTP. I'll calculate it quickly for you.
Sorry, I should have asked this question prior, but I'm not wanting to answer it right now. But I'll be very interested in this budget, what's the split between growth levels of service and renewals, please?
Monique, it's Sam. Monique, it feels like to me we're not getting clear direction around the table. Like there's 4 people who have spoken and it seems like it's a bit of a 50-50 at the moment. So like where does the table sit? It seems to be silence.
Well, I nodded without speaking when the question was first asked. I support the second bullet point.
I support the second bullet point.
And I also support the second bullet point. We have set a precedent before when we did exactly the same with the recycling capital funding that we needed to do 2 or 3 years ago, and it seemed to work reasonably well. So that's why I support this one.
Unfortunately, we probably don't have a choice unless there's something else that we can cut that's major.
Sorry, just a question to the Mayor. Are you referring to the recycling program? That's not capital fund, that's operational. Surely that was just, it came in at such a high level that we thought it was unacceptable to lump that all in 1 year and spread it across 3. That wasn't a capital expenditure.
Councillor Bishop, neither is this. This is operational as well.
Yeah, Councillor Bishop, because there's an extra, 5 million in capex over and the top of the increased annual OPEX for the remediation. I can't remember the exact figure, but yeah, there's an additional 4 or 5 million in capex that's not in the current capital program that has to come in at some point, probably as part of the LTP amendment next year, because that's not budgeted.
That's right. So just to highlight, Stantec did some work. This was mentioned in one of the briefings around the landfill. But in terms of the remediation budget, I think in terms of the capital budget in the long-term plan, there's about 350 or 400,000 that's budgeted for that work, for remediation work. But the work that was commissioned from Stantec around the leachate remediation said that it could be upwards of 4.8 million. So that while it wasn't part of the landfill consultation work, we felt that it was important to get an understanding of what that looked like, but that would need to form part of a LTP amendment potentially in terms of that level of capital. So part of next year's conversation.
Because Jacinta, sorry, just to follow up, because that funding requirement exists no matter what decision is made on the landfill, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So just a question really to you, Sam, from me. You spoke with some passion about your concerns about the rate of 1 mil from borrowings. Seem to be arguing that really a more honest way would be to load it onto rates, some of it at least onto rates. Where do you now stand?
Well, I guess having heard the 7.5% rates cap, and as Christine says, it's almost a Clayton's choice because we've got no scope to move. But I think that at a minimum, we just have to be upfront with the community about what the trade-off is here, which is we've ultimately constrained the rate increase by a further 3.4%, but that in turn, that's meant that we have had to incur further borrowings and more likely to continue to incur further borrowings. So for me, we just have to be upfront. We have to, if that's the decision of the table, you have to own it and explain the consequences of it, I guess.
Sam, I'm taking a bit of umbrage. I've been on this table since 2013. We've always been upfront about that. There's been many communications gone out to our community about how we're rating and why we're rating like we are. So this is not new. So just wanted you to be aware of that.
Well, as I say, just the sentiment that was generated around the table when we considered the rates decrease with the depreciation funding being debt funded, that just sort of indicated to me that there wasn't that understanding.
Yep, you may be wrong on that.
I think what we've heard really clearly as council officers is the need to ensure of the 2 points that we've got clarity on is around the transparency and the way we communicate wherever the annual plan lands, that what's driven the rates increase as a result of growth and what has driven it as a result of the landfill situation is important. Councillors, it is 3:56 and we start a Finance, Audit and Risk Committee meeting today. So we're going to suspend the annual plan conversation. We're going to have FAR committee and then we will continue the annual plan conversation after FAR. Thank you, councillors.
Can I do that?